A millionaire humiliated his daughter Nanny in front of his friends, thinking she was helpless. What she revealed about her life left him in shock. Ethan Grayson's penthouse was the epitome of modern opulence. Towering above the streets of Manhattan, its floor-to-ceiling glass walls offered a panoramic view of a city that thrived on ambition. Inside, the polished marble floors reflected the dim, warm light of designer chandeliers. The hum of conversation filled the air, interspersed with laughter as guests sipped from crystal glasses filled with the finest champagne. For Ethan, nights like this were routine, a chance to remind everyone in his orbit why he was the man they aspired to be. Leaning casually against the sleek black bar, Ethan surveyed the room. His tailored navy suit was a perfect match for his sharp, angular features, and his piercing green eyes carried the weight of a man accustomed to winning. Tonight's gathering wasn't just another soiree. It was a celebration of his latest acquisition, a tech company Ethan had bought for a record-breaking sum. "Another masterpiece," remarked Ben, one of Ethan's oldest friends, raising his glass in mock salutation. "Grayson strikes again. Honestly, Ethan, is there anything you can't turn to gold?" Ethan chuckled, his tone effortlessly self-assured. "It's not about turning things to gold, Ben. It's about knowing where the gold is buried in the first place." The group laughed, their admiration palpable. Among them was Alexis, a striking brunette with a quick wit and a knack for keeping Ethan on his toes. She leaned in with a teasing grin. "Careful, Ethan. One day, your ego might outgrow even this penthouse." He smirked. "If it does, I'll just build a bigger one." Their banter was interrupted by a faint laugh, a small, bright sound that cut through the polished murmurs of the party. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the hall leading to his daughter Clara's room. Her bedtime had come and gone. "That nanny of hers," Ethan muttered, setting his glass down on the bar. "I swear, she treats bedtime like a suggestion." Alexis arched an eyebrow. "The infamous Amelia? I've been meaning to ask, where did you find her?" "She's not exactly what I'd expect from you." Ethan shrugged, his tone dripping with condescension. "She came highly recommended. But honestly, you'd think she'd invest in something a bit more presentable. She's practically a walking thrift store." "Ethan," Alexis laughed, but there was a trace of reproach in her tone. "Don't tell me you're judging the help now." "It's not judgment, Alexis," Ethan replied smoothly. "It's an observation. In this world, presentation matters. And she's," he gestured vaguely, "unpolished." Before Alexis could respond, the room's double doors swung open. Ethan turned, and there was Amelia, carrying Clara in her arms. The room seemed to pause, the hum of conversation fading as eyes shifted to the unexpected pair. Amelia's entrance was understated but commanding. Dressed in a simple cardigan and a worn blue skirt, she was a stark contrast to the shimmering gowns and sharp suits surrounding her. Yet, she moved with an ease that suggested she was wholly unbothered by the opulence around her. Clara, her small arms looped around Amelia's neck, rested her head on the nanny's shoulder, her eyelids heavy with sleep. "Daddy," Clara mumbled, her voice soft but bright. "I wanted to say goodnight." Ethan's expression softened slightly as he stepped forward. "It's past your bedtime, Clara." Amelia met his gaze, her face calm and composed. She had trouble settling down. "I thought it best to read to her until she was ready." There was no hint of apology in her voice, only a quiet certainty. Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by staff. "I'm sure she did," he replied, his tone clipped. "But bedtime routines exist for a reason." Amelia adjusted Clara slightly, her hold steady. "She's asleep now," she said evenly. "I'll take her to bed." Ethan's eyes flicked over her, his annoyance bubbling just beneath the surface. Something about her unshakable demeanor irritated him. Most people in his employ bent, even if subtly, to his authority. Amelia, however, stood firm, not with defiance, but with a quiet strength that he found both perplexing and aggravating. As she turned to leave, he couldn't resist a parting shot. "Perhaps tomorrow, we can arrange for you to pick up something more fitting for your position. It's time you looked the part." The room stilled. A few guests exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh. Alexis smirked, clearly relishing the unfolding tension. Amelia paused, her back still to him. For a moment, Ethan thought she might ignore the remark. But then she turned, her eyes locking on his with a steady gaze. "Clara seems to think I'm just fine as I am," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "And she's the only Grayson whose opinion I care about." The air seemed to shift, a ripple of shock moving through the crowd. Alexis stifled a laugh, her eyes dancing with amusement. Ethan's smirk faltered, the sting of her words sinking in faster than he cared to admit. Before he could respond, Amelia turned and disappeared down the hallway, carrying Clara with the same unhurried confidence she had arrived with. "Well," Alexis said after a beat, her voice dripping with amusement, "she's certainly not boring." Ethan drained his glass in one sharp motion, his jaw tightening. He hated feeling outmaneuvered, especially by someone he considered beneath him. Amelia was a puzzle he hadn't anticipated, and Ethan Grayson didn't like puzzles he couldn't solve. As the night wore on, Ethan found his irritation growing. It wasn't just her words that lingered, but the way she had said them, with an air of quiet certainty that unsettled him. Who was this woman who didn't flinch under his gaze, didn't bow to his authority? "Ethan?" Alexis's voice pulled him back to the present. She was watching him with a knowing smile. "Don't tell me she's gotten under your skin." "Hardly," he replied, forcing a smirk. But as he turned back to the glittering skyline, a single thought tugged at the edge of his mind. There was more to Amelia than met the eye, and Ethan intended to find out exactly what that was. Before we dive deeper into the story, take a moment to think. What would you do if you were in Ethan's shoes? Would you have handled the situation with Amelia differently? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more intriguing narratives. Let's get back to the drama. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the quiet hallways of the Grayson penthouse as Ethan paced near the living room windows. The morning light poured through the expansive glass panels, bathing the room in a golden glow. Ethan's phone was pressed to his ear, his tone sharp as he barked instructions at one of his managers. "No, I don't want projections. I want results," he snapped, his free hand gesturing as if the person on the other end could see his frustration. "If this deal doesn't close by Friday, don't bother coming into the office on Monday. Understand?" Ethan ended the call with a sharp tap of his finger and let out a frustrated sigh. He was used to the world bending to his will, and moments of inefficiency grated on him like sandpaper. As he turned away from the window, his eyes caught a glimpse of Amelia walking through the room, a tray of breakfast items balanced in her hands. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her steps steady and purposeful. Clara trailed behind her, her small feet padding softly on the floor. Ethan frowned slightly, watching the interaction between them. His daughter, usually shy and reserved around new people, seemed completely at ease with Amelia. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," Amelia said as she approached the dining table, her voice calm and unassuming. She placed the tray down with practiced care, her posture straight but unpretentious. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he observed her. She wasn't like the other nannies he'd hired before, women who spoke in hushed tones and practically melted under his sharp gaze. Amelia had a steadiness about her that felt unusual. "Morning," he replied curtly, moving toward the table. "Clara, eat quickly. We have a busy day." Clara climbed into her chair, her small hands reaching eagerly for the plate of pancakes Amelia had prepared. "Can Amelia come with us today, Daddy?" she asked, her voice bright with hope. Ethan glanced at Amelia, who was pouring a glass of juice for Clara. "She has plenty to do here," he said, his tone dismissive. Clara's face fell slightly, but Amelia intervened before the mood could sour. "Don't worry, Clara," she said with a gentle smile. "We'll have plenty of time for adventures later." Ethan's brow furrowed as he watched the exchange. There was something about Amelia's calm assurance that irritated him. He wasn't used to being upstaged in his own home, even in subtle ways. "You seem awfully comfortable here for someone so new," Ethan remarked, his tone edged with a challenge. Amelia straightened, meeting his gaze with a quiet confidence that startled him. "I believe in adapting quickly, Mr. Grayson." It makes transitions easier for everyone involved. Her response was polite, but there was an undercurrent of firmness that Ethan couldn't ignore. He leaned back slightly, studying her. She was young, probably in her late 20s, but there was an air of maturity about her that didn't match her modest appearance. Her dark hair was tied back neatly, and her simple blouse and skirt were clean but entirely unremarkable. It was as though she wanted to blend into the background, yet her presence demanded attention. Adapting quickly, he repeated, his tone skeptical. Not a skill most people in your position possess. Amelia's lips curved into a faint smile, but she didn't take the bait. Instead, she turned her attention back to Clara, helping the little girl cut her pancakes. Ethan's irritation grew. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone who worked for him. After breakfast, Ethan retreated to his office, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Amelia. There was something about her composure that unsettled him. She didn't seem intimidated by him, nor did she go out of her way to impress him. It was as if she existed in her own bubble, entirely unaffected by the wealth and power that surrounded her. Later that afternoon, Ethan decided to confront his curiosity head-on. He found Amelia in the library, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Clara. They were surrounded by a small mountain of books, and Clara was eagerly flipping through the pages of a children's encyclopedia. Teaching her about dinosaurs? Ethan asked, leaning against the doorway. Amelia glanced up, her expression neutral. Actually, Clara was curious about fossils. I thought it might be interesting to show her how paleontology works. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. Paleontology? For a 6-year-old? She's bright. Amelia replied simply, turning her attention back to Clara. She's curious about the world, and I don't see any harm in nurturing that. Ethan stepped further into the room, his arms crossed. And what qualifies you to teach her about paleontology? Amelia looked up again, her expression calm but unwavering. I have a background in science. It's not my area of expertise, but I know enough to answer her questions. Ethan tilted his head, intrigued despite himself. A background in science? That's unexpected. Amelia didn't elaborate, and Ethan's curiosity deepened. He studied her for a moment longer before turning his attention to Clara, who was now animatedly explaining the difference between herbivores and carnivores. She's never been this enthusiastic about learning before, Ethan admitted, his voice quieter. Amelia's gaze softened as she watched Clara. Children thrive when they're given the freedom to explore their interests. Clara has a sharp mind. She just needs the right environment to let it flourish. Ethan didn't respond immediately. For a moment, the room was filled with the soft rustle of pages and Clara's excited chatter. When he finally spoke, his tone was more measured. You're full of surprises, Amelia. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. Life tends to be full of them, Mr. Grayson. Ethan left the library with more questions than answers. Who was this woman who seemed so unflappable, so at ease in a world she clearly didn't belong to? As he returned to his office, he made a mental note to learn more about her. Something about Amelia didn't add up, and Ethan Grayson wasn't the type to let mysteries go unsolved. Ethan Grayson sat at the head of the massive mahogany dining table in his penthouse, staring down at a tablet filled with financial reports. The sharp glow of the screen illuminated his face in the dim morning light, but his attention wasn't on the numbers. Instead, his focus kept drifting to the faint sound of laughter coming from the other room. Clara's giggles carried down the hall, a bright interruption in the otherwise muted atmosphere of his meticulously designed home. Ethan set the tablet down, his brow furrowing. He could hear Amelia's voice, steady and melodic, as she spoke to Clara about something. The occasional outburst of Clara's laughter suggested it wasn't just idle conversation. Amelia had a way of drawing Clara in, making even the mundane seem magical. Curiosity gnawed Ethan. He had hired Amelia based on sterling recommendations and a clean, if unremarkable, resume. Yet, the more he observed her, the less she fit into the tidy box he'd created for her in his mind. She wasn't overly deferential, nor did she seem overly eager to impress him. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that, at times, felt like a challenge. He stood and walked toward the sound of voices, pausing just outside the library door. The scene inside was almost jarring in its simplicity. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, a workbook open in front of her, while Amelia knelt beside her, guiding her through a math problem. "Okay, so imagine you have 10 apples," Amelia said, her tone playful but patient. "A dragon comes along and eats 4 of them. How many do you have left?" Clara giggled. "Dragons don't eat apples, Amelia." "This one does," Amelia replied with a grin. "Now, what's the answer?" 6, Clara shouted, clapping her hands. "Exactly," Amelia said, ruffling Clara's hair affectionately. Ethan stepped into the room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Both heads turned toward him, but only Clara greeted him with unrestrained enthusiasm. "Daddy, Amelia's teaching me about dragons and apples," Clara exclaimed, holding up her workbook. Ethan raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting from Clara to Amelia. "Dragons and apples?" he repeated, his tone skeptical. Amelia straightened, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "It's a creative way to teach subtraction," she explained calmly. Clara responds well to stories. Ethan folded his arms, studying her. "I suppose that's unconventional. Unconventional methods can lead to remarkable results," Amelia replied, meeting his gaze evenly. Ethan's lips tightened into a thin line. Most of his staff, regardless of position, tended to fumble under his scrutiny. But Amelia remained unshaken, her composure as steady as ever. "Can we learn about planets next, Daddy?" Clara asked, tugging on his sleeve. Ethan glanced down at his daughter, her wide eyes filled with excitement. "Planets?" "Amelia said there's a planet made of diamonds," Clara exclaimed. Ethan looked back at Amelia, his brow furrowing. "A planet made of diamonds?" Amelia nodded. 55 Cancri. It's an exoplanet, believed to have a carbon-rich composition. Ethan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "You know a lot about astronomy for a nanny." "I read," Amelia replied simply. There was no arrogance in her tone, but her brevity left Ethan feeling inexplicably challenged. He crouched beside Clara, flipping through her workbook. "Clara seems to be learning a lot from you," he admitted reluctantly. "She's curious and bright," Amelia said, her voice softening. "She just needs the right encouragement." Ethan rose, his expression unreadable. "Well, I hope you don't let her imagination run too wild. Practical knowledge is more valuable than fairy tales." Amelia tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Fairy tales and imagination can inspire innovation, Mr. Grayson. Many great minds started with a story." Her words lingered in the air, carrying a weight Ethan hadn't anticipated. For a moment, he felt like she was speaking directly to him, challenging his rigid worldview. The thought unsettled him. "Clara," he said, clearing his throat, "why don't you head to your playroom? I need to speak with Amelia." Clara hesitated, glancing up at Amelia. At her reassuring nod, she skipped out of the room, leaving the two adults alone. Ethan turned to Amelia, his expression hardening. "Let's cut the pleasantries. You're clearly overqualified for this job. So why are you here?" Amelia met his gaze without flinching. "I'm here because I want to be, Mr. Grayson. Helping children grow and learn is meaningful work." "That's not an answer," Ethan said sharply. "You're articulate, educated, and far too composed to be ordinary. So what's the real story?" Amelia's expression remained calm, but a flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, crossed her features. "Does there need to be a real story? Not everything is a puzzle to be solved." Ethan bristled. "In my experience, everything is a puzzle." "Well," she said evenly, "maybe this time, the answer is simpler than you think." Her words, delivered with quiet confidence, only deepened Ethan's frustration. He wasn't used to being stonewalled, especially not by an employee. Yet, Amelia seemed immune to his usual tactics, completely unfazed by his questions, his tone, or his authority. "Just remember," he said finally, his voice cold, "this is my house. I expect transparency and respect." Amelia inclined her head slightly. "Of course, Mr. Grayson. I expect the same." Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, She turned and walked out of the room, her steps as steady and unhurried as ever. That evening, Ethan found himself replaying their conversation in his mind. Amelia's words, her composure, her ability to disarm him with ease. It was all maddeningly perplexing. For a man who thrived on control and clarity, she was an enigma he couldn't ignore. As he stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, a thought crept into his mind. Who exactly was Amelia? And what was she hiding behind that unshakable calm? The Grayson estate was a flurry of activity, its vast halls echoing with the sound of hurried footsteps and the clatter of silver trays. The annual charity gala Ethan hosted was one of the most anticipated events in Manhattan's social calendar, a glittering display of wealth and influence where business tycoons and socialites mingled under the guise of philanthropy. Ethan thrived in such environments, where deals were sealed with a handshake over champagne and power was measured by the weight of one's donations. As he adjusted his cufflinks in front of the mirror, Ethan caught sight of Clara in her bedroom down the hall. She was perched on her bed, fidgeting as Amelia tied the sash of her ivory dress. His daughter's laughter, high and uninhibited, drifted into the room and broke through the hum of his thoughts. "Clara," Ethan called, his voice carrying over the bustle of preparation. "Are you ready?" Amelia stepped into the hallway first, Clara trailing behind her, her small hands clutching the folds of her skirt. Clara looked radiant, but Ethan's eyes were drawn to Amelia. Dressed in a simple, black evening gown with minimal jewelry, she carried herself with the same calm composure that had intrigued and irritated him in equal measure. The dress, though modest, highlighted her elegance, a stark contrast to her usual understated attire. "Why is she dressed like that?" Ethan's voice was low, directed at Amelia, but Clara answered before her nanny could. "I asked her to come," Clara said brightly, stepping forward. "I want her to see the party." Ethan turned to Amelia, his brow furrowing. "And you agreed?" Amelia met his gaze evenly. "Clara insisted, and I didn't see the harm." Ethan's lips tightened. "This isn't a playground. It's a formal event." "Noted," Amelia replied smoothly, her voice devoid of apology. Clara tugged on Ethan's sleeve, her wide eyes pleading. "Please, Daddy. I want Amelia to come." His jaw tightened, but he relented with a sigh. "Fine. Just stay in the background." Amelia inclined her head, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Mr. Grayson." The grand ballroom of the Grayson estate sparkled under the light of 1,000 crystals. Guests mingled in clusters, their conversations punctuated by bursts of laughter and the faint clinking of glasses. Ethan moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. But his focus kept drifting to the edges of the room where Amelia stood, watching over Clara. She was speaking with Clara, pointing out the intricate ice sculpture at the center of the room, when Alexis appeared at Ethan's side, her champagne flute held delicately between her fingers. "Is that Amelia?" Alexis asked, a note of amusement in her voice. Ethan followed her gaze and nodded curtly. Clara insisted. Alexis smirked. "She cleans up nicely. Almost makes you wonder why she spends her days chasing after kids instead of, well, being here." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What are you implying?" "Nothing," Alexis replied, her tone light. "She just doesn't seem the type to blend into the background." Before Ethan could respond, the soft chime of a spoon against glass drew the room's attention. A guest had taken the stage to announce the evening's schedule. Ethan seized the moment to step away, but his path crossed with Amelia's as she guided Clara toward the dessert table. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone as measured as always. "Fine," Ethan replied, though his tone was sharper than intended. He glanced down at Clara. "Don't eat too much sugar." Clara pouted but nodded, and Ethan turned away without waiting for a reply. He couldn't quite place the tension building in his chest. Amelia's presence, usually easy to ignore, was starting to feel like a persistent question he couldn't answer. As the evening wore on, Ethan found himself seated at a table near the center of the room, surrounded by his closest associates. The conversation ebbed and flowed, but his attention was drawn to the periphery of the event, where Amelia stood with Clara. She was speaking with one of the servers, her expression calm and attentive. "Ethan," one of his associates said, pulling him back to the present. "Who's the woman with your daughter? A new hire?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Her nanny." "She's not what I expected," the man continued, his tone curious. "She seems remarkably composed for her position." "She's competent," Ethan replied shortly, unwilling to engage further. The conversation shifted, but Ethan's mind remained on Amelia. Her presence at the gala, though inconspicuous, seemed to cast a shadow over his evening. She was a reminder of the puzzle he hadn't yet solved, a question that grew louder with every passing day. Near the end of the evening, Ethan found Amelia standing near the balcony, a glass of water in hand. Clara had fallen asleep in one of the upstairs rooms, leaving Amelia free to observe the event from a distance. Ethan approached her, his steps deliberate, and stopped a few feet away. "Enjoying yourself?" he asked, his tone neutral. Amelia turned to face him, her expression calm. "It's been enlightening." "Enlightening?" Ethan repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Seeing the world you live in," she replied. "The people you surround yourself with." Ethan frowned. "And what's your assessment?" Amelia took a sip of water before answering. "It's impressive, but it's also hollow." Her words landed like a quiet blow. Ethan's frown deepened. "Hollow?" Amelia met his gaze, her eyes steady. "You have all of this," she said, gesturing to the glittering ballroom behind them. "But I wonder if you ever stop to ask yourself what it's all for." Ethan's chest tightened, though he masked the feeling with a smirk. "You've known me for, what, a few weeks? And now you're analyzing my life?" "It's not an analysis," Amelia replied. "Just an observation." The silence between them stretched, heavy and unyielding. Finally, Ethan broke it with a sharp exhale. "You're very good at making people uncomfortable. Only the ones who need it," Amelia said softly. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he turned and walked away, the tension in his chest refusing to dissipate. As the gala came to an end, Ethan found himself alone in his study, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Amelia's words echoed in his mind, an uninvited guest in the solitude he usually cherished. For a man who had built his life on control, clarity, and precision, the uncertainty she introduced was both infuriating and intriguing. He didn't know who Amelia truly was, but one thing was becoming increasingly clear. She wasn't just a nanny. And Ethan Grayson wasn't the type to let a mystery go unsolved. The rain began with a quiet patter against the massive glass windows of Ethan Grayson's penthouse, then steadily grew into a heavy downpour. The city skyline outside shimmered beneath the wet haze, its usual brilliance muted by the storm. Inside, the air was filled with a different kind of tension, one that Ethan couldn't shake. He paced the length of the living room, his sharp footfalls echoing against the marble floors. The collar of his dress shirt was undone, and his sleeves were rolled up, a rare dishevelment that hinted at his frustration. His phone, usually an extension of his hand, lay discarded on the couch after a particularly heated call with one of his executives. The sound of soft footsteps drew his attention, and he turned to see Amelia entering the room. She carried a tray with a steaming cup of tea and a small bowl of soup. Her dark hair was neatly pulled back, but there was a hint of fatigue in her face that even her composed demeanor couldn't hide. "She's asleep," Amelia said, setting the tray down on the coffee table. "The fever's broken." Ethan exhaled deeply, a mix of relief and exhaustion crossing his features. "Good. I hate seeing her like that." Amelia nodded, but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she poured a cup of tea and handed it to him, her movements calm and measured. Ethan took it without a word, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "You stayed with her all night," he said finally, breaking the silence. Amelia sat down in the armchair across from him, her back straight but her posture relaxed. She needed someone. Children feel safer when they're not alone. Ethan frowned, running a hand through his hair. "I should have been there." "You were working," Amelia said, her tone neutral. "Clara doesn't hold that against you." "Maybe she should," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to her. He looked down at the cup in his hands, its warmth seeping into his skin. "You're very dedicated." Amelia tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Isn't that what you expect?" Ethan let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Most people I hire are dedicated to the paycheck, not the work." "Well," Amelia replied, her voice steady, "Clara isn't just work to me." Her words lingered in the air, quiet but pointed. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his green eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded her. "Why?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "Why do you care so much? You're a nanny, not..." "Not what?" Amelia interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "Not family? Not someone who matters?" Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. The weight of her question hung between them, and for once, he felt unsure of how to respond. Amelia's gaze didn't waver, and Ethan was struck again by the quiet strength that seemed to define her. "I didn't mean it like that," he said finally, his voice quieter. I don't understand you." Amelia's expression softened, though her composure remained intact. "There's nothing to understand, Mr. Grayson. I care about Clara because she's a remarkable child who deserves to feel safe and valued." Ethan watched her carefully, his mind racing. "You're not like anyone I've met before," he said, his tone laced with a mix of curiosity and frustration. "You don't act like someone who works for me." "Because I don't see myself that way," Amelia replied. "Clara isn't just your daughter. She's a person with her own needs, her own feelings. I'm here to make sure she has what she needs to thrive." Her words, though spoken softly, felt like a challenge. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "And what about you? What do you need?" Amelia blinked, surprised by the question. "Excuse me? You're clearly intelligent, capable, and composed," Ethan said, his tone growing sharper. "Why are you here? Why are you working as a nanny when you could be doing, I don't know, something bigger?" Amelia's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Sometimes the biggest things we do aren't what the world notices, Mr. Grayson." Ethan frowned, her words striking a nerve. He had spent his life chasing accolades, power, and wealth. Yet here was someone who seemed content to exist quietly, making an impact that no one else would see. The idea unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Before he could respond, a faint cry echoed from upstairs. Amelia rose immediately, her movements fluid and purposeful. "Excuse me," she said, already heading toward the stairs. "Clara needs me." Ethan watched her go, the tension in his chest refusing to dissipate. He had spent years building a world where everything was neat, predictable, and within his control. Amelia was none of those things. She was a question he couldn't answer, a puzzle he couldn't solve, and it irritated him to no end. Later that night, Ethan stood by the massive windows in his study, a glass of scotch in hand. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, and the city below sparkled faintly under the muted glow of streetlights. He stared out at the view, his mind replaying the conversation with Amelia. Her words had a way of sticking, planting themselves in his thoughts like seeds that refused to be ignored. "Sometimes the biggest things we do aren't what the world notices." He swirled the liquid in his glass, the faint clink of ice against crystal the only sound in the room. Ethan had always defined success by the visible: wealth, power, dominance. Yet, as he thought about Clara and the way she seemed to come alive under Amelia's care, he couldn't help but wonder if he had been missing something all along. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Amelia standing in the doorway, her expression calm but tired. "Clara's settled," she said. "She's sleeping soundly." "Thank you," Ethan said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. Amelia nodded but didn't move. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. "Good night, Mr. Grayson," Amelia said finally, her voice soft. "Good night," Ethan replied, watching as she disappeared down the hall. When the door clicked shut, Ethan turned back to the window, his reflection faint against the darkened glass. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of his own questions pressing down on him. Who was Amelia, really? And why did it feel like she was changing everything he thought he knew? The morning sunlight filtered through the towering windows of Ethan Grayson's office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. The room, a reflection of Ethan's meticulous nature, was immaculate, with sleek furniture and carefully arranged artifacts signaling his success. Yet, for all its perfection, Ethan's thoughts were anything but orderly. He sat at his desk, staring at the folder in front of him. It was a slim, unassuming thing, brown cardboard with a crisp white label bearing a single word, Amelia. Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the folder. He had ordered the background check a week ago, his curiosity about Amelia finally overriding any hesitation. Something about her didn't add up, and Ethan was not the type of man to let a mystery linger. Yet now, as he stared at the folder, he felt a flicker of unease. What if he uncovered something he wasn't prepared to face? Shaking off the thought, Ethan flipped the folder open. The first page contained the basics: her name, date of birth, and employment history. Everything seemed normal, too normal. It was as if her life had been deliberately scrubbed of anything noteworthy. But as he turned the pages, a name caught his attention: Richmond Technologies. Ethan frowned, leaning closer. Richmond Technologies was a company he knew well, one he had acquired years ago during a particularly ruthless takeover. The deal had been a highlight of his career, a masterclass in corporate strategy. But why was that name connected to Amelia? He flipped to the next page and felt his chest tighten. There, in stark black and white, was a detail he couldn't ignore: Amelia Richmond, former CEO. Ethan stared at the page, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift into place. She wasn't just a nanny. She had been a successful entrepreneur, leading a company with millions in revenue. And now, she was working for him, quietly blending into the background of his life. It didn't make sense. The sound of Clara's laughter pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He looked up to see her running through the hallway, her voice bright and carefree as Amelia followed close behind. For a moment, Ethan simply watched, his mind racing. "Amelia," he called, his voice sharper than he intended. She paused, her expression calm as always. "Yes, Mr. Grayson? Can I speak with you?" "Privately." Amelia nodded, instructing Clara to continue her game in the library before following Ethan into his office. She stepped inside, her posture relaxed but alert, and waited for him to speak. Ethan gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Have a seat." Amelia complied, her gaze steady. "Is something wrong?" Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "I've been looking into your background." Her expression didn't change, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, an almost imperceptible straightening of her back. "Have you?" "I know about Richmond Technologies," Ethan said, his tone measured. "I know you were at a..." For the first time, a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, crossed Amelia's face. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ethan demanded. "Why hide something like that?" Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line, and she met his gaze with quiet resolve. "Because it doesn't matter anymore. That part of my life is over. It doesn't seem like something you just leave behind," Ethan countered. "You built a company from the ground up. You were successful. And I walked away," Amelia replied, her voice calm but firm. "I had my reasons." Ethan leaned back in his chair, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "This doesn't make sense. People like you don't just disappear. Why are you here, Amelia? Why work as a nanny?" Amelia hesitated, her hands clasped in her lap. For a moment, Ethan thought she wouldn't answer. But then she looked at him, her expression softening. "Because I needed to start over. After the takeover, everything I had built, everything I cared about, was gone. Staying in that world wasn't an option anymore." Her words landed like a blow, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt he hadn't expected. He remembered the Richmond deal well, the strategic maneuvers, the calculated risks, and the lives that had been disrupted in the process. At the time, it had been nothing more than another victory. Now, sitting across from Amelia, he saw the human cost. "I didn't know," Ethan said quietly, though the words felt hollow. "Of course you didn't," Amelia replied, her tone devoid of malice. "You didn't care to know. To you, It was just a business deal. Her words stung, but Ethan didn't argue. She was right. In his relentless pursuit of success, he had rarely stopped to consider the impact of his actions on others. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words foreign on his tongue. Amelia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here for an apology, Mr. Grayson. I'm here because Clara needed someone. That's all that matters now." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the weight of her words. For the first time in years, he felt the cracks in the foundation of his carefully constructed world. Later that evening, Ethan stood in the dimly lit kitchen, nursing a glass of scotch as he replayed the conversation in his mind. Amelia's revelation had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. She had been a part of the very world he dominated, yet she had walked away, choosing a life of quiet simplicity over power and wealth. It was a choice Ethan couldn't comprehend, and one he couldn't stop thinking about. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie, and he turned to see Amelia standing in the doorway. She hesitated, then stepped into the room. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her voice soft. Ethan frowned, confused. "For what?" "For listening," Amelia replied. "Most people wouldn't have." Ethan set his glass down, his gaze steady. "You're not most people." Amelia smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Good night, Mr. Grayson." "Good night," Ethan replied, watching as she disappeared down the hall. When the room fell silent again, Ethan leaned against the counter, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. Amelia wasn't just a mystery. She was a mirror, forcing him to confront the parts of himself he had long ignored. And for the first time in years, Ethan Grayson wasn't sure he liked what he saw. The air in the Grayson penthouse was heavy with tension, a silence stretching between Ethan and Amelia that neither seemed willing to break. Ethan stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the backdrop of the city's glittering skyline. His usual confidence was absent, replaced by an unease he couldn't shake. Amelia sat across the room, her posture calm but her expression distant. She hadn't spoken much since their last conversation, but her presence alone was enough to stir the storm inside him. He turned from the window, his green eyes locking onto her. "I need to know something," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "When you agreed to work here, was it because of what happened with Richmond Technologies?" Amelia's gaze flickered, but she didn't look away. "What difference does it make?" "It makes a difference to me," Ethan replied, his tone sharper than he intended. "I need to understand why you're here, why you stayed." Amelia took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I stayed because of Clara," she said quietly. "She deserved better than the chaos surrounding her. I wasn't here for revenge, if that's what you're asking." Ethan frowned, his chest tightening. "But you knew. You knew it was me." "Yes," Amelia admitted, her voice steady. "I knew." The simplicity of her response was like a punch to the gut. Ethan had built his career on control, on knowing every angle, yet he had been blind to the impact of his actions on someone sitting right under his roof. He sank into the chair across from her, his elbows resting on his knees. "You should hate me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. "I did," she admitted, "for a long time. But hatred is exhausting, and it doesn't change anything." Her words hung in the air, their quiet weight heavier than any argument could have been. Ethan stared at her, searching for something. Anger, resentment, anything that mirrored the guilt he felt. But Amelia's expression was unreadable, a mask of composure he couldn't crack. "I don't know how to fix this," he said finally, the admission raw and uncharacteristic. Amelia studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Maybe it's not about fixing the past. Maybe it's about what you do next." The days that followed were a strange mix of tension and change. Ethan found himself reflecting on Amelia's words, the guilt gnawing at him as he reevaluated decisions he had once considered victories. The Richmond Technologies deal was just one of many acquisitions in his career, yet its consequences felt sharper now, more personal. He began to notice things he hadn't before. The way Clara lit up when Amelia was around, the quiet strength Amelia carried, even the small ways she had woven herself into their lives. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, a desire to be better. One evening, as Clara slept and the penthouse fell into its usual nighttime quiet, Ethan approached Amelia in the kitchen. She was washing dishes, her sleeves rolled up, and her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. The scene was almost domestic, a stark contrast to the chaos that usually defined his world. "Can we talk?" Ethan asked, his voice softer than usual. Amelia glanced at him, her expression neutral. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about what you said, about making a difference." Amelia set the dish she was holding onto the drying rack and turned to face him. And I want to do something," he said, his tone earnest. "I don't know what yet, but I can't keep living like this, acting like none of it matters." Amelia studied him, her gaze searching. "What brought this on?" Ethan shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe I've finally met someone who doesn't let me get away with anything." For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Amelia's face. "That's not much of an accomplishment." "It is for me," Ethan replied, his tone lighter. "I'm not exactly known for my humility." Amelia shook her head, but her expression softened. "If you're serious about change, you'll need to start by looking at the people your decisions have hurt." "I know," Ethan said, his voice firm, "and I will. But I also want to make things right with you." Amelia raised an eyebrow. "With me?" "Yes," Ethan said. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But you've done so much for Clara, for this family. I want to." Amelia held up a hand, stopping him. "Ethan," she said quietly, "this isn't about me. It's about you. If you want to change, you have to do it for the right reasons. Not because you're trying to make up for something." Her words hit home, and Ethan nodded slowly. "You're right," he said, "but I still want to try." The next morning, Ethan began taking small but meaningful steps. He reached out to former employees of Richmond Technologies, offering compensation and support to those whose lives had been disrupted by the takeover. He initiated changes within his own company, focusing on ethical practices and community engagement. And though it was just the beginning, it felt like a shift, a way to balance the scales he had so often tipped in his favor. Amelia watched these changes with quiet skepticism, her guarded nature preventing her from fully believing in his transformation. But as days turned into weeks, she began to see glimpses of sincerity in his actions. Ethan wasn't just talking, he was doing. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Ethan turned to Amelia. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "For what?" Amelia asked, her tone light. "For not giving up on me," Ethan replied. "Even when I didn't deserve it." Amelia's gaze softened, and for the first time, the wall she had built around herself seemed to lower. "I didn't stay for you, Ethan," she said, "but I'm glad you're trying." Ethan nodded, a faint smile on his lips. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Not for power, not for control, but for something far more meaningful. The early morning light spilled into the penthouse, bathing the space in a soft golden hue. Ethan Grayson sat at the edge of the expansive dining table, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The table, usually adorned with meticulously arranged centerpieces, was now scattered with papers, sketches, and plans. Ethan's meticulous nature seemed to have been traded for a newfound enthusiasm, a drive not for acquisition, but for purpose. Across the table, Clara hummed quietly as she worked on a drawing, her small hands carefully shading a picture of her family. She had drawn Ethan, herself, and Amelia, the latter standing between them with her ever-present calm expression. It was a simple, innocent depiction, but it stirred something deep in Ethan. "Daddy," Clara said, lifting her head, "are you going to be late for breakfast again?" Ethan smiled, setting his coffee down. "Not today, sweetheart. I'm all yours this morning." Clara's face lit up, and Ethan felt a pang of guilt at how rare these moments had been. He glanced toward the kitchen, where Amelia was preparing breakfast, her movements efficient but unhurried. She had become such an integral part of their lives that it was hard to imagine the household without her. After breakfast, Ethan excused himself to the study, where he had a scheduled call with a team of advisors. The focus wasn't another corporate acquisition or high-stakes negotiation, but the launch of a new initiative, one aimed at providing resources and mentorship for small businesses, particularly those left struggling after hostile takeovers like the one that had dismantled Richmond Technologies. It was a project born from the conversations with Amelia, her quiet influence reshaping the very foundation of how Ethan viewed success. The call ended after an hour, and Ethan leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. The city stretched out before him, a testament to his ambition, but it no longer filled him with the same pride. He had spent years chasing wealth and power, and while he had achieved more than most could dream of, it had come at a cost he could no longer ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. "Come in," he called, straightening in his chair. Amelia stepped inside, her expression as composed as ever. "Clara wants to take a trip to the park," she said. "Do you have time?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, glancing at the stack of papers on his desk. Then, without a second thought, he stood. "Let's go." The park was alive with the sounds of laughter and chatter, the autumn air crisp but pleasant. Clara ran ahead, her laughter ringing out as she chased a butterfly. Ethan and Amelia followed at a slower pace, the atmosphere between them more relaxed than it had been in weeks. "Clara seems happier lately," Ethan said, his hands in his pockets. "She talks about you constantly, you know." Amelia smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on Clara. "She's a remarkable child." "She is," Ethan agreed, his tone soft. "And she's changed me in ways I didn't expect." Amelia glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. "Change is never easy, but it's worth it." Ethan stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I need to say this," he began, his voice low but firm. "I've made a lot of mistakes, Amelia, not just with Richmond Technologies, but in how I've lived my life. I've taken more than I've given, and I don't want to be that person anymore." Amelia's gaze softened, and for a moment, the wall she had so carefully constructed seemed to lower. "You're already taking steps," she said. "That's more than most people do." "It's because of you," Ethan admitted. "You showed me what it means to care about something beyond myself." Amelia looked away, her expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly. "I did it for Clara." "I know," Ethan replied, "but you've given me a chance to be better, for her and for myself." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the park in hues of orange and gold, Clara ran back to them, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. "Daddy, can we get ice cream?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. Ethan chuckled, glancing at Amelia. "What do you think?" Amelia smiled, her demeanor lighter than usual. "I think it's a wonderful idea." The three of them walked to a nearby vendor, the simple act of sharing ice cream feeling more meaningful than any lavish event Ethan had attended in his life. As they sat on a bench, Clara nestled between them. Ethan felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling that had eluded him for years. That evening, after Clara was tucked into bed, Ethan found Amelia in the living room, reading a book. He hesitated in the doorway before stepping inside, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "Amelia," he began, his voice quiet, "I don't know how to thank you." She closed the book, looking up at him. "For what?" "For everything," Ethan said. "For being there for Clara. For showing me what I was too blind to see. For giving me a chance to be better." Amelia studied him for a long moment before replying. "You don't owe me anything, Ethan. The choices you've made are your own." "I know," he said, "but I wouldn't have made them without you." Her expression softened, and she nodded. "Then I'm glad I could help." Ethan took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I want you to stay," he said, "not as Clara's nanny, but as part of this family. You've become more than just an employee, Amelia. You've become someone I trust, someone I admire." Amelia's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "Ethan, I don't. Just think about it," he said quickly, cutting her off. "No pressure. I want you to know how much you mean to us." Amelia hesitated, then nodded. "I'll think about it." The days that followed were marked by a sense of renewal. Ethan continued to implement changes in his business, prioritizing ethical practices and community engagement. He spent more time with Clara, rediscovering the joy of being a father. And while Amelia remained cautious, there was an unspoken understanding between them, a mutual respect that had grown into something deeper. One evening, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Amelia turned to Ethan. "I've made my decision," she said. Ethan's heart raced, though he kept his expression calm.
"And
"I'll stay," Amelia said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But only if you promise to keep trying, to be the man Clara deserves." Ethan nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I promise." As the city lights sparkled around them, Ethan felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of hope. For all his wealth and power, it was the people around him who had given his life meaning. And for the first time, Ethan Grayson truly understood what it meant to be rich.